There we go. Welcome. We're going to take a quick minute to do introductions. My name is Ricardo Valadez. I'm the private equity campaign manager with Americans for Financial Reform. I lead a coalition of organizations who are fighting to stop private equity looting in different parts of different sectors of the economy, and to reform how the private equity industry operates broadly. And I'm excited to be a part of this summit today, to plug in a new constituency of physicians who are interested in fighting private equity as well as broader corporatization of medicine. So thank you all for having me and coming to this workshop. If you could, for your intro, I'm based in the Washington, D.C. area in Tacoma Park, Maryland. And I'd love to hear with your introduction what you're hoping to get, what brought you to this workshop and what you're hoping to get out of it.
Okay, I can jump in. My name is Terry Mulligan. I'm an emergency doctor. I work at the University of Maryland. I'm a professor there. I'm also on the board of American Academy of Emergency Medicine. And I'm deeply involved in global emergency medicine development. And over the last 20 years, I've worked in about 40 or 50 countries helping build emergency systems there. And we're seeing the same issues coming up in their emergency medicine development curve that have come up in ours. Namely, the struggle to establish ourselves and get a seat at the table. And once we get a seat at the table, that's when the real fighting begins. And often what we offer is so valuable that the vultures start to descend in the middle stages of development. And so we don't want to set people up to fail 10, 15 years down the road, kind of like we potentially are struggling now. I'm one of the co-organizers of this conference, and I'm very interested in learning more about the private equity system, particularly how it operates in general, and how to discourage its continued infiltration into medicine the way it has into every other facet of society.
Great, thank you for that. I can definitely help with that. I'll go to Regina next, if you don't mind, if you're able to introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi, I'm Regina. I am in the Chicago area, just graduated residency actually. And that's kind of what brought me to taking more interest in this. I think I've been kind of oblivious to this issue being at large academic medical centers for my medical school and graduate training, residency training. But then last year, entering the job market, definitely felt the sting of the pandemic and a lot of confusion among my colleagues about why was it so hard to get a job, like in major metropolitan areas for all of us graduating this past year. So that's kind of how I got involved, but interested in learning more about how we got here and what young physicians can do to help stem this tide.
Great, thank you. And we have Megan, who's shared with us that she's on the ladder and does not wish to be called on. So feel free to join us and pipe in if you're able, Megan. Otherwise, we'll get started. So again, thanks everyone for joining. I prepared a little PowerPoint presentation. I will try to get through that quickly so we have lots of time for some question and discussion. Let me see, I gotta get myself organized here. I will share my screen shortly. With this small group, just feel free to jump in and jump in with any questions as I go through this. And I will just pause the presentation and answer your questions. One moment while I share my screen. Can folks see the screen there? Okay. All right, again, I'm Ricardo Valadez with Americans for Financial Reform. Here's my email, ricardo@ourfinancialsecurity.org. If you have any follow-up or questions, and I will repeat that at the end of the presentation. So today we wanted to walk through why we need to take on private equity. What is private equity? How does it work? Avenues for fighting private equity, and then some tips on effective advocacy, whether it's with legislators, federal legislators, state legislators, or however you want to engage in your advocacy. A few tips on how to do that. Does that sound like a good agenda? Okay, great. So what have folks heard about private equity? How is private equity, what have you heard about it? Just to get a baseline of folks' kind of knowledge and how, if any, in any way, has it intersected with your personal or professional lives?
Well, I mean, in the medical profession, it's affected my life directly in that doctors I work with, residents who I'm training, are having difficulty over the last 20 years practicing in this environment. And, in other areas, I think, if you think about the top 20 industries, the majority of them are run or by 2, 3, or 4 companies that run and own everything. Whereas in healthcare, particularly provision of healthcare, the biggest 3 or 4 companies put together own less than 5%. So I think we're just a ripe, fertile ground. We have yet to have been bought and owned and divvied up by big business, at least in the providing care aspect of health.
Thank you for that, Terry. And welcome, Heather. Welcome to the presentation. We're walking through, I'll go back to review the agenda here. We're walking through why we need to take on private equity, what private equity is, how does private equity work, and what are some avenues to fight private equity, and a few tips on effective advocacy. Waiting for my next screen to load. So what we found is that a lot of folks encounter private equity in ways you don't always realize. Over the past 20 years, private equity has come to buy major brands and influential companies in virtually every sector of the economy. So folks might be familiar with one or more of these, kind of household name brands that either are owned or have been owned by private equity. And there are thousands more that folks, don't even know about. What we found is, what I like to say is private equity is often, the guys behind the guys, right? They like to stay in the shadows and let folks be familiar with the perhaps name brands. Private equity owners will, often make decisions about how these companies are run, but like to keep their names out of the press in most cases. So wanted to take a quick moment to kind of frame this discussion in a broader macro trend that we refer to as financialization. So financialization is the the trend that we've seen in our economy of the banking sector and the financial sector taking on more and more of the economy and playing a bigger role, having more control of the economy. And we've seen, that drive, income and wealth inequality and have a lot of negative impacts on, workers, on healthcare, on patients and consumers. And so when we talk about private equity, and our critique of private equity, it's sort of in this broader critique of financialization and the increased role financial markets and financial institutions in our everyday lives, including in medicine and healthcare. So let's take a minute to just define private equity, specifically kind of what it is, and then we'll get into how it operates. So in short, private equity firms are Wall Street companies that raise money from private sources like institutional investors and wealthy individuals to buy and sell existing companies. So at the sort of basic level, that's kind of how we define private equity. So here's a little chart on how private equity works in terms of how it raises money. So private equity firms have the founders and executives of private equity firms are called limited partners. And the limited partners, sorry, just checking my notes here. So sorry, the executives and founders are called general partners, and this is a chart of the limited partners. So the limited partners are people who put money into private equity funds, and that includes, kind of rich people in general. It includes money from universities and foundations, also called endowments. And a major contributor to private equity funds is pension funds, which is the retirement savings of public employees, teachers, firefighters, and other sort of regular folks. Now, these folks that put money into the funds don't have any say in how the private equity firms operate. But it's their money that's put to use in buying up these assets. Now, here's an overview of how private equity works. Unlike most firms on the stock exchange or most companies or other investors, private equity firms take control of companies and they change how they run. They don't just use investor money to buy companies. Sorry, they don't. They also they don't just. Sorry, let me start over there. They don't just use investor money to buy companies. They also use loans, and we'll talk more about those loans and the also referred to as leverage, and the role that plays in the destruction that they have in the economy. But they use loans to buy companies, and they put the loans go to the companies that they're buying. The loans go to help pay for the deal, and the company that they're buying has to repay the loans, not the private equity firm itself. And you'll see later why that's important. So once a private equity firm takes control of a company, they look for ways to increase the company's profit, even if it means layoffs, closing locations, selling pieces of the company, or other things that are not in the interest of the company long-term. PE firms usually sell the company within 5 to 7 years. That's the sort of goal that they put out for themselves, so the decisions that they make are focused on maximizing the amount of money they can make in that period. And then once the firm has sold the company, it doesn't care whether the company continues to function or not. And then, as you can imagine, that's especially harmful in healthcare when some of these companies that they're buying and selling and squeezing are critical to healthcare in a particular community. Now, this slide I call the anatomy of a private equity deal, and it goes back to what I mentioned earlier, which is the leverage, the loans that PE firms take out in order to complete these purchases. So the private equity industry, they used to be known as leverage buyout firms, and they sort of rebranded into private equity. This chart here shows that private equity firms, the general partners, they put a very small portion of their own money into the deal, typically only 2 to 3% of the deal. And then they raise another 25 to 40% from investors, also known as limited partners, into buying the company. But typically, the rest of the financing for the deal comes in the form of debt. 60% is kind of a very average number. Some deals go up into 70, even 75% is in leverage in debt. And again, that debt goes onto the companies that they're purchasing and not the PE firm. So, I mentioned that private equity firms use, have a small window to extract as much money from these companies that they have in the short amount of time that they have them. And I call this, the private equity's extraction playbook. And so here are some of the most typical strategies they use to take money out of companies. I did mention they use debt or leverage to fund the purchase of the company. But in addition to that, they often take out additional loans on the company with simply to buy back shares, which makes them richer, or to directly pay themselves bonuses. So they control that entirely. The rest of the stakeholders in the company don't control that, and so it leads to some very perverse incentives, right? They can make decisions to make themselves rich shortly, but very quickly put a lot more debt on the company without regard to the long-term health of the company. Another strategy they use is they compromise services to customers and patients instead of investing in the health of the company. So they might cut hours in order to save money. They may squeeze worker pay and benefits in ways that harm the brand, harm the customer or patient experience. Again, they're not typically very concerned with that because they can make money quickly. They definitely squeeze workers, force layoffs, cut pension contributions. A major strategy they use is selling off company assets. So often the biggest asset the company has is real estate. And so we've seen this as a huge trend in retail as well as news businesses, newspapers. A private equity firm will come in, buy a popular brand like Toys R Us, load the company with debt, sell off the company's assets, and then force the company to lease back the store that they once owned in order to continue operating. And what that does is it creates additional challenges for the company to be profitable, but it does make the PE firm short-term money. So it's a very common strategy. Another strategy for them is they structure these deals so that any damages they cause, the company is liable for, but the private equity firm is not liable. So for example, year before last, there were two actually refineries that were private equity owned, one in Texas and one in Philadelphia, that exploded. Right, they exploded, caused damage to not only the plant but the environment and nearby communities. And then if anybody wanted to sue the company because of the harm that it did to the neighborhood, for example, and people who lived in the neighborhood, or health effects that folks in those neighborhoods had, the company simply could go bankrupt, and the private equity firm who may have been responsible for cutting safety standards, not investing in the infrastructure of the plant, making the decisions that led to the accident, they're not liable. They can walk away scot-free. So these are some of the sort of structural elements of how private equity operates that makes them damaging regardless of what sector of the economy they're operating in. I'm going to pause here and see if there are any particular questions about about the private equity business model, how they operate, and then we'll get into some more information about the reach of private equity and some case studies on how this business model has played out. But I wanted to pause here and see if there are any questions about how the industry operates. Terry,
I put in the chat in the chat box. It sounds like that scene from the Goodfellas.
Right.
When they force their partnership into the restaurant and then order and dump all this debt onto the restaurant owner. And then when nobody else will lend or send anything else, they burn the place down, liquidate.
Right. Right.
Same thing.
Exactly. Any other questions or comments? All right.
Is Hahnemann going to be one of your examples that you talk
It
about?
is, in fact.
Okay.
It is, in fact, exactly one of the examples that we'll get to in maybe 5 or 7 slides. All right. I'm trying to change slides. I don't know if my computer's frozen or what's going on here. Okay, I'll try to share again. All right, so let's consider the reach of private equity and in the size. So currently there are about 2,800 public corporations listed on the New York Stock Exchange. Does anybody have any ideas on how many private equity owned companies there are? Any guesses? Most people don't realize how big private equity is. And so there are less than 3,000 companies listed on the stock exchanges in the US. There are 9,000 private equity owned, between 8 and 9,000 private equity owned businesses in the US. So well over 2 times as many companies owned by private equity than are listed on the public markets. So it's huge. It's much bigger than most people think. And so part of what we're trying to do is draw attention to that. And it's only poised to get bigger. So the private equity industry has a term known as called dry powder. And what that means is that's the cash they have on hand in order to buy more businesses, right? And so as you can see, from 2006, it was about 350 billion in dry powder, and by 2020, we're up at $728 billion. So private equity firms are currently sitting on around over $700 billion to buy more companies. And so as you can project here, the footprint, as huge as private equity is, their footprint is, poised. They're about to expand even more. So let's run through some case studies on private equity looting. And yes, Hahnemann is absolutely one. So after the 2008 financial crisis, right, there was a hollowing out of the housing market, and housing prices absolutely plummeted. And private equity, had a bunch of cash sitting around, and they came in and bought up tons of housing. And, at first they thought they were just going to flip that housing and sell it. But prices didn't rebound quite as quickly as they had thought. So they were sitting on a lot of real estate, which for a long time was just blighted housing, right? Blocks and blocks of unoccupied houses that private equity firms owned. And it was, that was part of what was keeping housing prices down and holding the recovery, because people couldn't go buy them. They were already owned by investors, including Blackstone, which is was at one point one of the largest homeowners, one of the largest real estate owners in the country. And so they turned that housing stock into rental properties. And so Blackstone, in this case, created Invitation Homes and became the country's largest landlord of single-family homes with about 80,000 properties. And we've worked with groups who organize tenants over the years, and we did a report a few years ago that documented how Invitation Homes was a terrible landlord. They were unresponsive to issues of maintenance and repairs. The report documents, terrible living conditions. They drove rent hikes far above the median, in those markets. They added a lot of fees that, like we've heard, for example, one private equity owned, this wasn't Invitation Homes, but one private equity owned landlord, for example, they require you to go through them to pay the water bill, but then they charge you like, $20 a month to pay your water bill, just for the privilege of having them hold the account. Things like that, where they just like the banks have done with fees, private equity firms have done that in housing, and wrong button. And in this case, Invitation Homes. Blackstone since sold Invitation Homes, but continues to buy up residential and commercial property in different markets. Here we go, Hahnemann Hospital, very relevant to you all, and for folks who know the story, which I assume most of you do, at least a little bit, it's really one of the worst and most egregious examples. In 2017, private equity hospital chain Paladin bought two Philadelphia community-based safety net hospitals with at least $35 million in debt. That included Hahnemann Hospital. I mentioned selling off or transferring real estate. The real estate was valued at $58 million. They transferred that into a separate business. And then they, drove Hahnemann into bankruptcy in 2019. The hospital shut down, cost 2,500 jobs, including 800 union nurses, and left nearly 600 physicians in training without residency placements. Now, if folks recall, during the start of the pandemic, when cities were looking for, places to stage, health and recovery, healthcare, emergency kind of beds, they looked to the owners of the private equity owners of Hahnemann to see about reopening it, and they wanted to charge something, $1 million a day or something absolutely insane, and instead of sort of being a good Samaritan in a time of national crisis, they played hardball and wanted to charge so much that Philadelphia ended up using an alternate facility, even though there's a hospital facility sitting right there in downtown Philadelphia. And now the sort of update to the story is that real estate developers are lining up to do a major redevelopment here. And when Hahnemann went into bankruptcy, because the real estate was moved to a different company, those assets are no longer subject to bankruptcy provisions, and helping fund for example, pension funds of all the people who were laid off, or any severance or anything like that might have benefited all the folks who lost out because of that deal. It sounded like somebody had additional or had some familiarity with this case. Was there anything else you wanted to share about Paladin, about Hahnemann?
No, not really, but as a resident during that time, I think there was a lot of outrage because those residency spots also got sold off at exorbitant prices. And those residents were left without any, like they had newly matched at the time when the bankruptcy was announced, and then were left without a plan, which
Right.
was just horrific.
Right. So now we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk kind of big picture about specific ways that we're helping fight back against private equity. So they're individual company fights. So, for example, when Toys R Us when Toys R Us was owned by a private equity firm, workers there started organizing, and we work with an organization called United for Respect. They organize retail workers, and the retail workers started organizing and telling the story of what was happening in their stores. Their vacation was getting cut, their hours were getting cut. A lot of the promises, there were a lot of longtime employees, 10-year employees, 15-year employees that had been counting on, vacation days that they had accrued, and payouts to sick days and things that, they had literally, kind of built their long-term financial plans around. Well, when the private equity firms came in and started changing all of that, the workers started organizing with United for Respect, and started kind of documenting that and telling that story. And then when the private equity firms took Toys R Us into bankruptcy, the workers were at first they were promised, they were given zero notice. They were not given any severance. Of course, they were just cut off from healthcare benefits, and they fought back, and they had to wage a months-long campaign, a very public campaign, and shame the private equity firms into providing a kind of worker relief fund. And workers at other PE-owned firms that have been taken to bankruptcy have in some cases replicated that model of organizing, of public campaigning, to get concessions once the company goes into bankruptcy. So that's one strategy that we've been kind of documenting and supporting. Obviously, once this ship is sinking, right, just making sure certain folks have access to lifeboats is a limited way to fight, such a powerful adversary. So that's an important part of the fight, but it can't be the only part of the fight, right? So we have to continue telling the story of private equity's impacts on people's lives, through advocacy, through communications work, through lifting up the stories of folks like the United for Respect members who are fighting back. And then there's changing the rules that allow private equity to operate the way they do, and that leads us to working on legislation like the Stop Wall Street Looting Act, which we'll talk about a little more further on. And then, I don't have this as a bullet, but there may be other ways, and we're always open to other ways of fighting private equity in particular industries. So for example, and that could be at the state level or the federal level. So for example, in New York State, New York State has a law that prohibits private equity or any private ownership of nursing homes and hospitals. So obviously that's a powerful law that prevents private equity from looting healthcare in New York, right? The Stop Wall Street Looting Act is a large piece of legislation. It's very ambitious, but it would fundamentally change the way the private equity industry is able to operate in the US. So it limits the amount of debt that PE firms can load onto companies. It holds private equity firms accountable for losses and liabilities. So right now I mentioned, they make all the business decisions about these companies, but they're not liable for any of the losses or the damages they cause. And that the Stop Wall Street Looting Act would change that. It changes bankruptcy laws to protect other stakeholders like workers in the bankruptcy process when bankruptcies do occur. And it removes some of the preferential tax treatments that private equity firms and private equity executives now enjoy, like the carried interest loophole that that lines their pocketbooks at the expense of other taxpayers. So I'm going to pause there and see if there are any questions about private equity or the Stop Wall Street Looting Act before we start talking about advocacy and how you all might be effective or more effective advocates for fighting private equity and fighting corporatization in medicine more broadly. All right. If you do have other questions, just don't hesitate to jump in, but I will move on. I think we've got about 10 more minutes, which is just about enough time to go over some tips on effective advocacy. So there are a lot of different ways to be advocates, and I'll throw out a couple, right? You know, when folks think about advocacy, often the first thing that people think about is lobbying. And yes, lobbying is an important tool. You know, meeting with lawmakers is an important tool in getting your voice heard. But there are others that folks should consider, including writing and circulating letters or recommendations. This sometimes to me feels very arcane. You know, I'm here outside of DC, sort of writing letters that circulate among a small elite group of policy thinkers and lawmakers. It feels very like, you know, like the founding fathers. You know, you would write a letter that circulates among a small influential group of people, but actually that's still how a lot of opinion among policy elites is influenced. So in addition to direct lobbying, you know, kind of documenting a position of a particular group or set of important people is another way to think about advocacy. So think about these tips as, you know, broadly when you think about different forms of advocacy. And these tips I'm going to share with you would cut across all different forms of advocacy. So, you know, I've been involved in different policy campaigns and advocacy work for almost 20 years. And, you know, these sort of advocacy tips are sort of, you know, broadly accepted as, you know, as good ways to, you know, engage folks who you are trying to influence. So the three kind of core tips I would share with you is, you know, develop and utilize your unique voice. And we'll dive into each one of these with a little more detail. Stick to a core message and have the discipline on your core message, and develop relationships. I like to say, you know, meetings are short, but relationships should be long. And if you think about advocacy that way, it will make you a more effective advocate in the long term. So, you know, using your unique voice, let's dive into that a little bit. So, oops. Start by thinking about what unique perspective can you share? What, you know, lawmakers think of, you know, hear from people all the time, right? And so what makes you stand out from anybody else who's going to talk to them about a particular issue? Be very clear with yourself about what is your unique perspective that you can share with that person, as opposed to going down a laundry list of like talking points that, you know, on like overall your general issue. What is, because chances are they've encountered those talking points before, and your unique opportunity to make a difference really is about your unique voice. What perspective can you share that they haven't already heard? And think about as you develop that, and as you think about how to share that, think about what makes you passionate and motivated about the subject. And then when possible, speak from your direct experience. And if it's not possible to speak from your direct experience, speak to people who you know, a colleague, a student of yours, or a mentor who faced this problem that illustrates why your recommendations are relevant, or why, yeah. Now, developing your core message, you really want to pick one or two things that you want them to remember. So when you talk to congressional staff or legislative staff or the legislators themselves, they spend 12 or more hours a day, hearing about policy recommendations and different people's opinions. And you will not be effective in getting them to remember your 12-point plan. As perfect as your 12-point plan might be, they will not remember that. You want to pick one or two at most core messages that you hit several times in your communication, that you want them to remember. Even if they forget your name or your organization, they're going to remember those 1 or 2 points. Next, you want to connect your unique voice and your unique perspective to the action that you want them to take. So, at the beginning, you should make your perspective clear, and then you want to really say what you think should happen, right? What are you advocating for? And make that connection between your personal story, your personal experience, and why you think it's important that they take this position or advocate in this particular way. Next, on the message, you really want to stay on message. It's really easy to get distracted from your 1 or 2 points that you want them to remember. It's really easy to get in the weeds too much. It's really easy to try to tack on 3 or 4 other things that you think are also important. But I'm telling you that when you try to do that, you're muddying the waters, and you want clear waters for them to see the 1 or 2 things that you want them to remember. That's how you're going to stand out. That's how you're going to get your really core prioritized message to stand out. Some particular tips for developing your core message and message tips for physicians that we came up with is, you all have a unique perspective to advocate, and which you do. I've heard at this summit already. Lead with your concern for patients. You are the ones who are in contact with your patients every day. Physicians are seen generally as a privileged class, right? And patients, when they come to the hospital or and especially the emergency room, as are very vulnerable, and you have a unique position to advocate, leading from the perspective of and concern of your patients, which from what I've heard, you're already doing. Really embrace the ethos that led you to become emergency doctors, and don't be afraid to talk about that, right, in your advocacy. And finally, stay focused on the real villain, which is the corporate actors, the people who, as Terry said, when we were chatting before we started, their incentives are misaligned, right? And then sometimes they are intentionally bad actors in the space in ways that harm patients and harm the system in which you all operate. So stay focused on who the real villain is, and in addition to staying focused on your 1 or 2 your 1 or 2 points you want to convey, make sure you're staying focused on the real villain. Now a few points on building the relationship. I'll reiterate, your meeting, if you're going to have a lobby meeting, it'll be 30 minutes at maximum. and often less than that. So you want the meeting to be the first step, in your advocacy relationship, and you don't need to see that as your only shot. So during the meeting, you want to be genuine and show your passion about the issue, and you want to focus on that more than the 12 points that you think are important, right? You want to be genuine, show your passion, in order to establish and build the relationship with the lawmaker or their staff. And you can leave the materials to read and share later, right? So, it's not to say that your 12-point plan isn't important. It is very important. But you shouldn't feel like you have to cover your 12 points during that meeting, or you always want to leave them with materials to read and share with their boss and their colleagues. Similarly, related to that, you want to offer to be a resource. If you do a good job, being genuine and showing your passion and leaving them with useful resources, you're creating a resource for them, right? These are folks who often have a lot of questions about a lot of different areas, and they want to talk to experts. They want to talk to people who are on the front lines. Offer to be a resource for them. Let them know how to contact you. Let them know what you can provide to them in terms of stories or data or perspective or whatever you feel like you're bringing to the table. Let them know that you want to be a resource for them going forward. And then finally, after you've had that initial contact and you've started that relationship, if there are developments that happen, in your area that you think they should know about, touch base with them, reach out, let them know, hey, we met 3 months ago on this issue. There's this new study that came out I thought you might be interested in. Drop them a note, keep in touch. Every 2 or 3 months, or, think of something that, they might want to, it could be as simple as an article, right? An article or an op-ed from somebody influential they might care about, or, a new study or new data, or a story that that you heard or you experienced, right? To say, hey, this happened to me, and I thought based on our conversation, you might be interested in this because it ties to this trend that we were talking about. So I'm almost out of time. I actually am over time now, but I wanted to share those with you, and again, share my email to practice what I preach here and be a resource to you all. I'm Ricardo Valadez with Americans for Financial Reform. My email is ricardo@ourfinancialsecurity.org. And please do keep in touch and see me and us as a resource in fighting the corporatization of medicine, and in particular, private equity's role in the economy broadly and in your space specifically. So thanks for being here, and we'll be in touch.